In this lesson, we'll take a very introductory look at the process of working with cloners. So the process of working with cloners is really a very core component of MoGraph. So with the cloners, this is how we start to essentially populate our scenes where we can then start to add dynamic animation, all kinds of really nice effects. So cloners, like I said, are very important, and that's probably what we're going to spend a very sizable portion of this entire course talking about, is just all the ins and outs and the aspects of using cloners. So let's go ahead and get started with just this relatively simple scene. We have this cube set up here. So to drop in a cloner, we go up to the MoGraph menu and just simply drop in a cloner. Okay, so my cloner's been added. You can see that really right now nothing happens. So in order to use a cloner, what we have to do is take any kind of an object and then parent it underneath that cloner, or make it a child of the cloner. So I'm just going to take this cube, just simply drag and drop this underneath my cloner. Now if I click on the cloner, we can actually start to see some thing has definitely happened. So essentially what I have right now are 3 clones of this cube. So if we were to go into this cloner object, take a look inside this object tab, we have our overall count, so this controls how many clones we have. Below this, we also have the ability to control the transformation, scale, and rotation of each one of these clones. So for example, you can see that right now these 3 clones are actually sort of sitting on top of each other and actually interpenetrating each other pretty strongly. So if I wanted these to be able to move up to the point where they are no longer interpenetrating, I just go to my amount down here, start to increase my transformation until we have enough space between those. We can also start to control the number of clones that we have by just starting to dial up this count. And you can start to see if I swing my camera up that we start to get more and more of these clones as we start to increase that. Now if I wanted these to maybe stretch out in this z-axis, what I could do is maybe just take this y, set that back to 0, and then start to increase those along the z-axis, or whichever axis I want to move those along. I can actually even use a combination of axes if I want to. Now, when it comes to moving these around and actually controlling these as far as their actual position and their placement, when it comes to using this mode, we really have 2 steps, or 2 different types. The first is the per step, which as we start to increase this, you can see it's actually moving each one of these clones up by a certain increment. Now, we also have the option to use what's called an endpoint option. Now, the difference between these two is we can see with the per step, because it's moving each one of these a certain increment, as we continue to add more and more of these clones, you can see our tower keeps growing more and more. Now, we may have a situation where we have maybe a certain length that we want to be able to maintain, and we really just want to populate that distance with a certain number of clones. So what we can do is set the end point, and now what we can do is say, okay, I want the end point to be at a certain precise point, so I want it to be exactly 600 centimeters high, and let's say, just for the sake of demonstration, exactly 1200 centimeters in the z-axis. So now with that set, what you'll see is a very noticeable difference, where now as I start to increase my clones, you can see my distance from one end to the other really does not change at all. All it does is start to control how many clones are put between those. So just a little different way of working. We also have the ability to control not only the clones' size increments, but we can also start to control things like their scale and rotation. So for example, if I were to start to bring this scale down for any of these 3 axes, you notice that each time this object gets duplicated, it gets smaller and smaller. We can also start to do the same with the rotation. So as we start to adjust that, we can see that each one of these little guys is rotating just a little bit. Now in my case, you can see that it's really not rotating this entire curve. You can see it's really just rotating each one of these individual cubes, or these individual clones. So what I could do is scroll down just a little bit further, and down here we have the step rotations. Now as I start to increase these values, we can actually start to see where this starts to move in a little bit more unified way. So it's actually now sort of swiveling all of these clones around. So we can really start to get some pretty interesting effects like this. And again, with this set to endpoint, we can just continue to add as many clones as we want and start to adjust that accordingly. Now again, with this step mode, we actually have 2 different values that we can use, or 2 different types that we can use. One is the single value, which really just lets us type in a certain value. So if I were to type in 180, what I should see is that this has now bent this all the way around in a nice clean 180-degree arc. Now with a cumulative, we get a very, very different result. So with this one, if I were to set this back to 0 and 0 to begin with, as we start to bring up this step rotation, we should start to see where really low values start to have a very, very dramatic impact. Now with this, essentially what we're doing is, just like the name suggests, we're giving each one of these a cumulative effect to where this little guy at the end is actually receiving the rotational values from the one behind it, which is receiving all the rotations from the one behind it, and so on and so forth. So you can see as we start to get further and further toward the end, each one of these is receiving all the transformations and all the rotations from the previous clone. So we start to get a much more dramatic effect as we start to get a little bit closer back to the end here. So just some different ways of actually coming in and being able to spin that around and rotate it. Now, a couple of things that I want to talk about before we wrap up this lesson is the actual mode. So we are right now setting this to a linear mode, so it kind of draws these out a nice straight line. We also have the ability to use something like a radial method. So once I switch that to a radial method, you can see now a few of these options have changed. Where now we can start to adjust things like the radius. We can start to adjust the actual number of clones that are applied here. And again, just start to come in and customize this pretty heavily. Now we also have a grid array where we can start to actually fill up a little bit more of a grid-like surface. Again, we can start to control the amount of spacing between each one of these clones. We can start to control how many rows of clones are going to be applied for the X, Y, and Z directions. We even have a little bit of control over the actual type of a volume that this is going to try to fill. Alright, now we also have the object cloner, which we'll talk about this actually in its own special lesson, so we'll definitely come back to that one. And then finally, I just want to show you one little feature that you might find sort of useful in some situations. If we find ourselves really to where we don't necessarily want to have to come in here and use some of these sliders and spinners or type in a value, we actually have the ability to come in and manipulate this cloner with a little bit more interactivity directly within the viewport. So if you come in, and if you look very, very closely, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but there's actually a little orange dot on either end or either corner of this cloner. Now what I could do is actually grab that and then move that a little bit more interactively, so now I can actually control things like the distance of these actual cloners and start to, again, maybe stretch this and pull this up to a certain point in my scene if I know that it needs to reach that particular area. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be talking a lot about these cloners in some of the following lessons. So we'll start to get into some of the different cloning methods. We'll start to talk about some of these additional options, as well as really starting to get in and understand some of the nuances of working with cloners and a lot of these other parameters that go along with that. So for now, that's just a pretty introductory look at how we can start to work with cloners in Cinema 4D.